Hi, this is Paul, and I've been through 4 chapters of C.S. Lewis's Miracles, and kind of bouncing those ideas off of Jordan Peterson. And I want to do a little bit of a pause here and a little bit of reflection on C.S. Lewis, what he's talking about when he's talking about reason and nature. Now, I'm fully aware that a number of you listening to my videos, because I'm a Christian minister, would say, you doubt materialism because you're a Christian. Now, I can't help but hear these arguments after Lewis as in some ways validating Lewis's complaint about naturalism. Because what we say that there's a bias or a prejudice or a hierarchical cost to thinking clearly, what we're saying is that human beings have this capacity to reason. And this capacity to reason then yields truth. And we know that human beings often reason poorly, and reason is by no means a guarantee of truth, but we always validate and prioritize reason, which is kind of like intentionality. It's following a process. It's developing a chain of evidence. Now, you might call this evidentialism. That's a word that comes into the conversation. But I never hear a conversation with a materialist in which they don't somehow validate reason. And well, there's a reason for that. But does that reason therefore invalidate any attempt to reason? And so C.S. Lewis in his book kind of sets nature up against reason, capital R reason, capital N nature, and basically says that we can't help in our discourse but believe that this certain process is the way that we see truth, the way that we can describe truth, the way that we can communicate truth one to another. Now, this is so deeply embedded within our culture that, that argument in a sense helps the naturalist, because it says, yes, this is a cultural argument, but that then doesn't help the naturalist, because, well, then show me your transcultural argument. And then you say, well, we can't have one. Okay, but then does that put truth in jeopardy? Now, the reason I wanted to bring Thomas Nagel into this conversation is because Thomas Nagel is not a Christian. And working through C.S. Lewis's Miracles has sent me back to Thomas Nagel. And whereas I started reading this book a number of years ago, I set it down and I didn't finish it. Now I'm quite a bit more motivated to get through Nagel's book. So I wanted to pause Lewis a minute and go to Nagel, because what's interesting is that Nagel basically makes the same type of argument that Lewis makes. But now Lewis was arguing in the 1940s and the 1950s, and Nagel is a contemporary. We're in the 2010s now. And Nagel is making this argument. And whereas on one hand, all that we've learned about the brain seems so often to suggest to us, oh, maybe the naturalists are right. Maybe these feelings that I have, these motivations that I have, all of this stuff is so deeply constructed that I'm unaware of its construction. But Nagel then takes the turn to point out, but yes, that doesn't let us out of the trap. That just digs the hole deeper, and what are we going to do with it? So to know the truth, you must transcend your social historical limitations. So if you say, well, I can't believe you because you're a Christian, or I can't believe you because you're a man, or I can't believe you because you're white, or I can't believe you because you're black, or I can't believe you because you're an alcoholic, or I can't believe you because you went to Harvard, or I can't believe you because you don't have any education. All of those things suggest that nature, which is just letting things rumble without intentionality, without this exercise of reason, yields nothing that we determine to be truth, nothing that we can therefore publicly engage and contend with in a public way. And this leads us back then to this monarchical vision, what I've called, where we basically claim implicitly often to say, this is the way things are. This is the only perspective. This is the perspective that limits out and excludes out all of the distorting factors, and now we know the truth. Now, I'm also reading right now, I've always read way too many books at once, Alan Jacobs' How to Think, and I'm really enjoying this book. It's a really wonderful book, and I think in a lot of ways it's a nice companion to 12 Rules for Life. And Jacobs goes into the fact that when we so often tell people to think for themselves, well, you've been indoctrinated as a Christian, or you've been indoctrinated as an atheist, you've been indoctrinated into postmodern neo-Marxism, you're possessed by this ideology, you need to think for yourself. And Alan Jacobs takes a step back and says, hey, wait a minute. That's not really how this works. None of us think for ourselves. We think in terms of communities. When a person stops believing what she's told and learns to think for herself, but here's really an interesting, important thing, that's not what happens. He uses in this chapter Megan Phelps, who was part of the Westboro Baptist Church. Megan Phelps Roper didn't start thinking for herself. She started thinking with different people. To think independently of other human beings is impossible. And this then, qualifies and casts doubt on this monarchical vision that we so often assert, and that is implied in how we discourse, how we talk with each other. To think independently of other human beings is impossible. And if it were possible, it would be undesirable. Thinking is necessarily, thoroughly, and wonderfully social. And this is why we do Jordan Peterson meetups and people get together. It's like, oh, now I can talk about Jordan Peterson because I've tried talking about it with my spouse or my friends or my roommates or my parents, and they're sick to death of hearing it. You people understand. Well, we're whole creatures. We crave community. Everything you think is a response to what someone else has thought and said. And when people commend someone for thinking for herself, they usually mean ceasing to sound like people I dislike and starting to sound more like people I approve of. And this is why I love Alan Jacobs' book. He's very brutally honest about these implicit biases and motivations we have that basically cloud our thinking. Now, does this make us more rational, or does this qualify everything to basically say C.S. Lewis's idea of rationality is a myth? A myth in the pejorative sense. C.S. Lewis' idea of rationality is a made-up thing, and there's no hope of rationality, therefore there's no hope of truth. And if that is the case, then we're left in the land of the skeptics. And to say, well, I'm a skeptic, I can't believe in anything. Skepticism was a school of thought in ancient Greece. It's been picked up again now and then. We usually treat it kind of like an analog dial. We turn up the skepticism, we turn down the skepticism. Very few people actually promote it, but sometimes I think that if I weren't a Christian, I would be a skeptic. And I don't mean just a skeptic about God. I mean a skeptic about a lot of things. The difficult thing with being a skeptic is it's hard to live because you can't live fully skeptically. You always have to make determinations about what's true and what's right. I feel hungry. Well, I don't know if I'm hungry or not. I'm a skeptic. No, I feel hungry, or I want to do this, or I want to do that. So this is the point. This is a point worth dwelling on. This point about we don't think for ourselves. We think with people. This is a point worth dwelling on. How often don't we say she really thinks for herself when someone rejects the views that we hold? No. When someone departs from what we believe to be the true path, our tendency is to look for bad influences. In other words, when we think they're being irrational, we look to nature, or we look to, this is again why I often say, everyone thinks sociology of knowledge belongs to everyone else, but not me. I'm the one who, by virtue of either my God-given insight, or my great rational brain, or my wonderful parents, or my great powers to see the truth, I somehow know the truth, and the rest of you blind people are kind of feeling up the elephant. She's fallen under the spell of so-and-so. She's been reading too much Jordan Peterson, or listening to too much Sam Harris, or going to church. Heaven forbid. Similarly, people in my line of work always say that we want to promote critical thinking, but we really want our students to think critically only about what they've learned at home and in church, and not about what they learned from us. Now Alan Jacobs is an academic. He's a professor of, I think he's a professor of literature. But he's also a professing Christian. And so he sees this tension from both sides. When we believe something is true, we tend also to see the very process of arriving at it as clear and objective, and therefore the kind of thing we can achieve on our own. When we hold that a given notion is false, we ascribe belief to it in some unfortunate wrong turning, usually taken because an inquirer was led astray, like Hansel and Gretel being tempted into the oven by a wicked witch. And this again, when we look at Lewis, we say, this is what Lewis is talking about. We imagine that reason can lead us to the truth, but when someone has stopped thinking from themselves and has been indoctrinated into postmodernist, neo-Marxist ideology, or has been converted into Christianity or Islam, or has been red-pilled, then suddenly they're not thinking for themselves. Now it's nature. It's not reason. So, this is what we're talking about with Lewis. And Peterson is very much in the mix here as we get into Thomas Nagel. Now, again, the reason I want to get into Nagel is because Nagel is not a Christian. So C.S. Lewis says that this capacity or process by which we arrive at the truth, which makes sense of nature. In other words, when we stand back and say, I can get this petroleum out of the ground and we can do some chemical things to it. You would not find this in nature. And if you were hiking along in Yosemite National Park and you found this at the floor, you would think either A, someone lost it and wants to look for it, or B, why don't these people pick up after themselves so I can enjoy nature? And so we all know that this capacity to reason, what C.S. Lewis calls reason with a capital R, makes sense of nature, helps us dominate nature, makes sense of the world. This is the whole project of science. It provides a monarchical vision of it, which is validated by prediction, outcomes, and technology. After Trump got elected, I wanted to find some Trump fans. Because, again, if you read Scott Alexander, if you live in a pretty blue place, it's like, who likes Trump? Nobody around me. Certainly not too many of the black folks, not too many of the Hispanic folks, not too many of the Asian folks. I don't live in a particularly white context. And so I thought I better listen to some Trump folks. Otherwise, my biases are not going to let me kind of judge what's going on in the country very rationally. And so, hey, there's Scott Adams. And so I started reading his book on how to succeed, and I started reading some of his things. And he said, he's kind of in this, he's been reading brain books, and, we can't really know things, so there's a pervasive skepticism, but our capacity to know the truth is validated by prediction, which, again, I think is a very funny thing, because when I go back to the Wild Wild Country documentary that I saw about the Bhagwan, well, the senator believed on intuition that the Bhagwan had caused salmonella in the Dalles, this town in Oregon, whereas the experts had said, no, it's probably bad food handling. Now, eventually, after the Bhagwan just kind of lets it out because he's blaming the Sheila, then we all, now it's the Rajneeshis who have poisoned the salad bar. Well, so ability to predict, it too is not vouchsafe. So naturalism says reason is a product of evolutionary development. And this is exactly where Thomas Nagel steps in, because Nagel, he's called a heretic by this Weekly Standard piece, not because he stepped out of line from the church. He's not a part of the church. He's not a believer at all. In his books, he's very much an atheist, but I'm definitely thinking of asking Jordan Peterson what he knows of C.S. Lewis, because everybody's saying that to him now, and I know he's reading these articles. I also want to know if he's read any Thomas Nagel, because what he might find in Thomas Nagel is a very interesting conversation partner and a world-class philosopher who is wrestling with these issues and wrestling with it publicly, and in my opinion, wrestling with it courageously, because he's now been found as a heretic of the temple of naturalism. So now I am going to try once again and see if I can get an audible book to play and see if this works for us, because this is pretty tough reading and I'm not the greatest reader, as you all know. And so let's see how the YouTube peeps like this.
The aim of this audiobook is to argue that the mind-body problem is not just a local problem, having to do with the relation between mind, brain, and behavior in living animal organisms, but that it invades our understanding of the entire cosmos and its history. The physical sciences and evolutionary biology cannot be kept insulated from it, and I believe a true appreciation of the difficulty of the problem must eventually change our conception of the place of the physical sciences in describing the natural order.
So this is the reason Thomas Nagel is writing this book, that when he says that the mind-body problem is not just a local problem, this is not just a question of, well, how does my brain do this? This is a question that casts doubt on the current framework which is governing the scientific and, in many ways, non-scientific political world. And so Nagel, as a philosopher, is saying, if we really want to be evidentialists here, if we really want to continue this project started by Descartes and Locke of constructing justified beliefs and therefore using that as a platform not just for my personal ethic, but for social and political life, we better pay attention to this problem. And now this is what gets him in trouble with people, because they're saying, no, there's no problem here. And Nagel is saying, yeah, there's a big problem here.
Natural order. One of the legitimate tasks of philosophy is to investigate the limits of even the best developed and most successful forms of contemporary scientific knowledge. It may be frustrating to acknowledge, but we are simply at the point in the history of human thought at which we find ourselves, and our successors will make discoveries and develop forms of understanding of which we have not dreamt. Humans are addicted to the hope for a final reckoning, but intellectual humility requires that we resist the temptation to assume that tools of the kind we now have are in principle sufficient to understand the universe as a whole. Pointing out their limits is a philosophical task, whoever engages in it, rather than part of the internal pursuit of science. Though we can hope that if the limits are recognized, that may eventually lead to the discovery of new forms of scientific understanding. Scientists are well aware of how much they don't know, but this is a different kind of problem, not just of acknowledging the limits of what is actually understood, but of trying to recognize what can and cannot in principle be understood by certain existing methods. My target is a comprehensive, speculative world picture that is reached by extrapolation from some of the discoveries of biology, chemistry, and physics. A particular naturalistic Weltanschauung that postulates a hierarchical relation among the subjects of those sciences, and the completeness in principle of an explanation of everything in the universe through their unification. Such a worldview is not a necessary condition of the practice of any of those sciences, and its acceptance or non-acceptance would have no effect on most scientific research. For all I know, most practicing scientists may have no opinion about the overarching cosmological questions to which this materialist reductionism provides an answer. Their detailed research and substantive findings do not in general depend on or imply either that or any other answer to such questions. But among the scientists and philosophers who do express views about the natural order as a whole, reductive materialism is widely assumed to be the only serious possibility.
And someone asked in the comments, what do I mean by the temple of materialism, or the temple of naturalism? Well, that's the temple of naturalism. It's we're cultured beings, and we, just as Alan Jacobs notes, we believe in community, and right now the community says this, and okay, but we also know that this function of believing in community is part of the natural process by which we believe, and many of us have suspicions that, well, if you're believing with everyone else, well, then you don't really have your own reasons for it. You're following the herd. And so what Alan Jacobs says is, yeah, you've always got to follow the herd. And so we as Americans take a step back and we say, well, maybe I should think about it for myself. And yes, you should. But now here's the problem. If you do think about it by yourself and you do break with the herd, there's going to be a price to pay. You're going to pay a price in your hierarchy. You're going to pay a price in your family. You're going to pay a price in your friendships. You're going to pay a price in your work. And, we at Americans say, well, that's wrong. Well, yeah, but it's older than the trees, my friends.
The starting point for the argument is the failure of psychophysical reductionism, a position in the philosophy of mind that is largely motivated by the hope of showing how the physical sciences could, in principle, provide a theory of everything.
And that's exactly, oh, please stop that. That's exactly what naturalism is doing. Say, well, here's Darwin, and therefore this must be the theory of everything. It's the whole show. And Nagel is saying, I don't think so.
If that hope is unrealizable, the question arises whether any more or less unified understanding could take in the entire cosmos as we know it. Among the traditional candidates for comprehensive understanding of the relation of mind to the physical world, I believe the weight of evidence favors some form of neutral monism over the traditional alternatives of materialism, idealism, and dualism.
Now his neutral monism, he's tipping his hand a little bit, because the point of this book is to try to offer an alternative to these. Well, that's probably going to be about as hard as making a fairy tale, and he knows that. So he's offering this up to have the conversation, and then how conversations work, people push back, and this is hopefully the process of all of us working together. We'll be smarter than we are by ourselves, which is, if you listen to Jonathan Haidt, this is the great human advantage.
And dualism. What I would like to do is to explore the possibilities that are compatible with what we know. In particular, what we know about how mind and everything connected with it depends on the appearance and development of living organisms as a result of the universe's physical, chemical, and then biological evolution. I will contend that these processes must be reconceived in light of what they have produced if psychophysical reductionism is false. The argument from the failure of psychophysical reductionism is a philosophical one, but I believe there are independent empirical reasons to be skeptical about the truth of reductionism in biology. Physico-chemical reductionism in biology is the orthodox view, and any resistance to it is regarded as not only scientifically but politically incorrect.
Now, when earlier he talked about a hierarchy, and you'll hear him go through this before, the universe begins with physics, and then physics and chemistry make biology. And this is kind of this is the foundationalism of a naturalist worldview, that this is the whole show. This is all there is.
Correct. But for a long time, I have found the materialist account of how we and our fellow organisms came to exist hard to believe, including the standard version of how the evolutionary process works. The more details we learn about the chemical basis of life and the intricacy of the genetic code, the more unbelievable the standard historical account becomes. This is just the opinion of a layman who reads widely in the literature that explains contemporary science to the non-specialist. Perhaps that literature presents the situation with a simplicity and confidence that does not reflect the most sophisticated scientific thought in these areas. But it seems to me that, as it is usually presented, the current orthodoxy about the cosmic order is the product of governing assumptions that are unsupported, and that it flies in the face of common sense. I would like to defend the untutored reaction of incredulity to the reductionist neo-Darwinian account of the origin and evolution of life. It is prima facie highly implausible that life as we know it is the result of a sequence of physical accidents together with the mechanism of natural selection. We are expected to abandon this naive response, not in favor of a fully worked out physical-chemical explanation, but in favor of an alternative that is really a schema for explanation, supported by some examples. What is lacking, to my knowledge, is a credible argument that the story has a non-negligible probability of being true. There are two questions. First, given what is known about the chemical basis of biology and genetics, what is the likelihood that self-reproducing life forms should have come into existence spontaneously on the early Earth, solely through the operation of the laws of physics and chemistry? The second question, is about the sources of variation in the evolutionary process that was set in motion once life began. In the available geological time since the first life forms appeared on Earth, what is the likelihood that, as a result of physical accident, a sequence of viable genetic mutations should have occurred that was sufficient to permit natural selection to produce the organisms that actually exist?
So in other words, this is probably the prevailing reason for doubt of the temple of naturalism, that, okay, so you got a 16 billion year time span. Well, 16 billion is a big number. Okay, but then you start breaking that thing down and you begin to ask the question, well, you've got the fine tuning. Everything had to be just right for life to develop. Well, the universe is very, very big. And as he's saying here, we appeal to these, well, 16 billion is a long time. Oh, the universe is very, very big. These are our justifications. He's saying, okay, but even so, you're not really telling me, you're not really giving me an explanation. You're just saying, don't doubt. Well, okay, but isn't that what we do in church? I mean, that's why I call it a temple. That this is an orthodoxy, this is a dogma, this is a pattern of belief, and it's a pattern of belief that's reinforced by social and communal carrots and sticks. If you abide by the doctrine, you are rewarded and allowed to ascend up the hierarchy. If you buck the doctrine, you are an outcast. You are in fact, heretic.
There is much more uncertainty in the scientific community about the first question than about the second. Many people think it will be very difficult to come up with a reductionist explanation of the origin of life, but most people have no doubt that accidental genetic variation is enough to support the actual history of evolution by natural selection, once reproducing organisms have come into existence. However, since the questions concern highly specific events over a long historical period in the distant past, the available evidence is very indirect, and general assumptions have to play an important part. My skepticism is not based on religious belief, or on a belief in any definite alternative. It is just a belief that the available scientific evidence, in spite of the consensus of scientific opinion, does not in this matter rationally require us to subordinate the incredulity of common sense. That is especially true with regard to the origin of life.
Now again, notice the use of rationally in here. We simply can't help. So if you read C.S. Lewis and you think about what he says with rationality, and you think about this chain of intentionality by which we arrive at something that we can declare to be true, we simply can't have conversations about this apart from this system. Now you might say, if you go back to Neil Postman, I don't have his book at hand here, in a different culture, you might say a proverb, and then everybody listening to the proverb says, yeah, that's true. Or let's say in a Christian community, you might quote something from the Bible, and everyone say, okay, yeah, that's true. Well, in the context, in the regime of rationality, this is the way we do it. And as Lewis says, well, if it's all from nature, then I itch and I think, and hydrogen and oxygen make water. They're all the same because it's all part of the naturalist vision. And this will be similar to where Nagel will go.
The world is an astonishing place, and the idea that we have in our possession the basic tools needed to understand it is no more credible now than it was in Aristotle's day. That it has produced you and me and the rest of us is the most astonishing thing about it. If contemporary research in molecular biology leaves open the possibility of legitimate doubts about a fully mechanistic account of the origin and evolution of life, dependent only on the laws of chemistry and physics, this can combine with the failure of psychophysical reductionism to suggest that principles of a different kind are also at work in the history of nature, principles of the growth of order that are in their logical form teleological rather than mechanistic. I realize that such doubts will strike many people as outrageous, but that is because almost everyone in our secular culture has been browbeaten into regarding the reductive research program as sacrosanct, on the ground that anything else would not be science.
And so this is where Jordan Peterson is kind of in a middle position, because on one hand, he's got Harris and Dawkins on one side saying, "Hey, you're leaving the temple here. You're sounding a little heretical." And I'd love for Jordan Peterson in his talk with Sam Harris to say, "Thomas Nagel," and to watch Sam Harris go, "Whoo!" Because I think that's the role that's happening here with Nagel. And whereas, well, when we get to some of the things that Nagel said, you see why he's a heretic. And when you hear Alvin Plantinga use some of these things, some people in the Christian community say why he's a heretic. And, truth makes heretics of many of us.
My project has the familiar form of trying to meet a set of conditions that seem jointly impossible. In addition to anti-reductionism, two further constraints are important. First, an assumption that certain things are so remarkable that they have to be explained as non-accidental if we are to pretend to a real understanding of the world. Second, the ideal of discovering a single natural order that unifies everything on the basis of a set of common elements and principles. An ideal toward which the inevitably very incomplete forms of our actual understanding should nevertheless aspire. Cartesian dualism rejects this second aspiration, and the reductive programs of both materialism and idealism are failed attempts to realize it. The unifying conception is also incompatible with the kind of theism that explains certain features of the natural world by divine intervention, which is not part of the natural order. The great advances in the physical and biological sciences were made possible by excluding the mind from the physical world.
Now, where have you heard this before? This is a point Peterson makes again and again, because where Nagel's coming at it from one side, Peterson's going to kind of come at it from the other side and say, now, wait a minute, we excluded these things. Why are they sneaking under the door?
World. This has permitted a quantitative understanding of that world, expressed in timeless, mathematically formulated physical laws. But at some point,
again, that timeless understanding of the world, that's the monarchical vision. This is the thing we have to do in order to do science. It's the way we have to see the world, and we work hard at stripping things away so we can achieve this monarchical vision, however suspect and impersonal we try to make it. And that's in fact why we use reason, to try to strip everything away and imagine that we arrive at it.
At some point, it will be necessary to make a new start on a more comprehensive understanding that includes the mind.
And that's, basically what Nagel is hoping humanity comes up with. And he doesn't want God to be involved. And in this book, he'll actually be honest about that. He'll say, I don't want God to be involved because I don't want anybody telling me what to do. Okay, but if a number of generations rejected God because of motivation, well, we're going to use motivation to reject him on this score too? Well, that's kind of funny.
Mind. It seems inevitable that such an understanding will have a historical dimension as well as a timeless one. The idea that historical understanding is part of science has become familiar through the transformation of biology by evolutionary theory. But more recently, with the acceptance of the Big Bang, cosmology has also become a historical science. Mind, as a development of life, must be included as the most recent stage of this long cosmological history. And its appearance, I believe, casts its shadow back over the entire process and the constituents and principles on which the process depends.
And again, this is where Peterson comes in, because Peterson, he will come in and say, yeah, mind is important. And when you cut mind out, what else are you cutting out? And this then gets into Peterson's definition of true in his Darwinian sense, because he's saying, there's a number of places in Peterson's argument where he says mind comes in. One of those things is sexual selection in human beings. Because of the way human beings select partners, mind is a part of the evolutionary pattern within humans. Now you might say, well, humans haven't evolved that much, but socially we certainly have evolved considerably. How does mind figure in? And Nagel is in a sense saying, yeah, we've excluded mind, but that's a big exclusion. And so when you say, well, because we have physics and then chemistry and biology, and we're pretty sure about how those things go. Therefore, the whole system works just like those things. Well, that's the definition of C.S. Lewis's naturalism. And Nagel is looking at this and saying, yeah, but you've got these three things, and you've forgotten mind. And in a sense, Lewis comes in with reason, and reason, as Lewis says, isn't exactly mind, but you don't do reason without mind. And that's a big part of Lewis's argument.
The question is whether we can integrate this perspective with that of the physical sciences as they have been developed for a mindless universe. The understanding of mind cannot be contained within the personal point of view, since mind is the product of a partly physical process. But by the same token, the separateness of physical science and its claim to completeness has to end in the long run. And that poses the question, to what extent will the reductive form that is so central to contemporary physical science survive this transformation?
And when in Transliminal 2015, Peterson talks about, what concept of matter will in the future, will we have in the future? I think he's knocking on this same door here too.
If physics and chemistry cannot fully account for life and consciousness, how will their immense body of truth be combined with other elements in an expanded conception of the natural order that can accommodate those things?
And this is, of course, where the naturalists say, no, physics and chemistry can account for the life of consciousness. And that is, again, the divide that Lewis is working on and Nagel is working on.
As I have said, doubts about the reductionist account of life go against the dominant scientific consensus. But that consensus faces problems of probability that I believe are not taken seriously enough, both with respect to the evolution of life forms through accidental mutation and natural selection, and with respect to the formation from dead matter of physical systems capable of such evolution. The more we learn about the intricacy of the genetic code and its control of the chemical processes of life, the harder those problems seem. Again, with regard to evolution, the process of natural selection cannot account for the actual history without an adequate supply of viable mutations. And I believe it remains an open question whether this could have been provided in geological time merely as a result of chemical accident, without the operation of some other factors determining and restricting the forms of genetic variation.
And again, this is partly why the word accident is something to understand how it is being used, because accident here essentially means non-teleological, undetermined, that no one was guiding it. And we use that word colloquially when two people are driving and someone turns away or gets distracted and bam, they have an accident. And however, in our systems, we always give cause. You are to blame. You were looking at your cell phone, or you were driving drunk. Well, here there's no one, and so we're saying this happened blindly. But this is, this is where, in a sense, naturalism. I haven't. Maybe someone in the comment section will. I haven't heard someone within naturalism really account for what accident is, apart from non-intentional. And again, this is where Lewis's nature versus reason, intentionality is a big element of that. And what Nagel is saying is that from the start of the Big Bang, what in a sense we're talking about is a historical process. And because that's a historical process, even if, as with the movement of electrons, we are not able to predict, we are not even able to track. That's the whole idea behind quantum theory, that, oops, it's over here. We are not able to do that. Well, we're small-minded creatures. We're not that smart, really. We're not able to do it, but this is why naturalism so often yields determinism, that this is the natural process if left to itself, and this is the whole show. There's no mind, there's no teleological elements coming to play in it.
It is no longer legitimate simply to imagine a sequence of gradually evolving phenotypes, as if their appearance through mutations in the DNA were unproblematic, as Richard Dawkins does for the evolution of the eye. With regard to the origin of life, The problem is much harder, since the option of natural selection as an explanation is not available, and the coming into existence of the genetic code, an arbitrary mapping of nucleotide sequences into amino acids, together with mechanisms that can read the code and carry out its instructions, seems particularly resistant to being revealed as probable given physical law alone.
Now the point before here, where it's much harder to regard the origin of life, the problem is much harder since the option of natural selection as an explanation is not available. And this is part of the reason why whenever we talk about natural selection, you'll hear this with Brett Weinstein, genes want. What do we mean by that? Well, because we're not certainly saying that these tiny little chemical elements have motivation. Well, but they have teleology. They have ends that they're seeking. And in a Darwinian sense, we say they are seeking survival. Okay, well, they're seeking survival. Well, why? And what does it mean for these non-conscious things to seek something? Well, we kind of see that with, you can even just do that with magnets. Positive and negative poles attract, so they seek something. So is this just an accident of language? Well, it's a peculiar accident of language. And part of the reason, part of why we should pay attention to it is because language is the only tool that we have to communicate what is reasonable or rational to one another.
In thinking about these questions, I have been stimulated by criticisms of the prevailing scientific world picture from a very different direction. The attack on Darwinism mounted in recent years from a religious perspective by the defenders of intelligent design. Even though
And this is where he gets really heretical for his temple. And Alvin Plantinga, who's been a conversational partner of his, who gets mentioned a few times in his books, I've heard Alvin Plantinga within the Christian philosophical community get criticized similarly. And that's kind of a sense where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so, well, here he goes.
Though writers like Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer are motivated at least in part by their religious beliefs, the empirical arguments they offer against the likelihood that the origin of life and its evolutionary history can be fully explained by physics and chemistry are of great interest in themselves.
Now it's also interesting here that, again, if you look at Lewis's scheme of natural versus rational, Nagel is very fair because he's saying, yeah, they've got some religious motivations, but should we assume that their religious motivations completely undermine the arguments they're making? Now, I know a lot of ardent, hardcore naturalists who will say, yeah, if there's any religion in the mix, it's contaminated. Well, then everything gets contaminated. And so show me your perfect biasless brain. Now, Alan Jacobs and Jordan Peterson and a good many other brain people will say, yeah, when you take out the biases in a human brain, they make poorer decisions. So, yeah. So where is this? Where is your clean room for your ideas where it's perfectly rational? And again, then you go back to the rationality thing and you say, and Lewis, then you're back looking at Lewis, and Lewis says, all right, you want to play this game about rationality? Well, look at what you say we are, and then still play this game. You can't do both.
In themselves. Another skeptic, David Berlinski, has brought out these problems vividly without reference to the design inference. Even if one is not drawn to the alternative of an explanation by the actions of a designer, the problems that these iconoclasts pose for the orthodox scientific consensus should be taken seriously. They do not deserve the scorn with which they are commonly met. It is manifestly unfair. Those who have seriously criticized these arguments have certainly shown that there are ways to resist the design conclusion, but the general force of the negative part of the intelligent design position, skepticism about the likelihood of the orthodox reductive view, given the available evidence, does not appear to me to have been destroyed in these exchanges. At least, the question should be regarded as open. To anyone interested in the basis of this judgment, I can only recommend a careful reading of some of the leading advocates on both sides of the issue, with special attention to what has been established by the critics of intelligent design.
In other words, he's saying, all right, you naturalists, you want it to be pure reason. Well, your anti-religious bias is showing. Don't just say, I'm not gonna believe these people because they don't worship at the house of Darwin. Look at their arguments. If you really want to be reasonable and don't be biased. And again, this is why Nagel is hated.
Design. Whatever one may think about the possibility of a designer, the prevailing doctrine that the appearance of life from dead matter and its evolution through accidental mutation and natural selection to its present forms has involved nothing but the operation of physical law cannot be regarded as unassailable. It is an assumption governing the scientific project rather than a well-confirmed scientific hypothesis. I confess to an ungrounded assumption of my own in not finding it possible to regard the design alternative as a real option. I lack the sensus divinitatis that enables, indeed compels, so many people to see in the world the expression of divine purpose as naturally as they see in a smiling face the expression of human feeling.
Now, if you listen to Alvin Plantinga will actually appeal to the sensus divinitatis fairly regularly. That's the sense of the divine that John Calvin talks about and others in Christian theology have talked about in terms of our bias towards a God.
Feeling. So my speculations about an alternative to physics as a theory of everything do not invoke a transcendent being, but tend toward complications to the immanent character of the natural order. That would also be a more unifying explanation than the design hypothesis. I disagree with the defenders of intelligent design in their assumption, one which they share with their opponents, that the only naturalistic alternative is a reductionist theory based on physical laws of the type with which we are familiar. Nevertheless, I believe the defenders of intelligent design deserve our gratitude for challenging a scientific worldview that owes some of the passion displayed by its adherents precisely to the fact that it is thought to liberate us from religion. That worldview is ripe for displacement, in spite of the great achievements of reductive materialism, which will presumably continue for a long time to be our main source for concrete understanding and control of the world around us.
Now, I thought that it is ripe for displacement, and I think, okay, well, what I just mentioned in my Ross to Thought video, I haven't posted it yet, I will in a minute, that, here we are, ripe for displacement. And again, Peterson is knocking on this door, but he's coming at it not as a philosopher, he's coming at it as a psychologist, as a Jungian, and so very interesting.
World around us. To argue, as I will, that there is a lot it can't explain is not to offer an alternative, but the recognition of those limits is a precondition of looking for alternatives, or at least of being open to their possibility. And it may mean that some directions of pursuit of the materialist form of explanation will come to be seen as dead ends. If the appearance of conscious organisms in the world is due to principles of development that are not derived from the timeless laws of physics, that may be a reason for pessimism about purely chemical explanations of the origin of life as well. Chapter 2. Anti-reductionism and the natural order. 1. The conflict between scientific naturalism and various forms of anti-reductionism is a staple of recent philosophy. On one side, there is the hope that everything can be accounted for at the most basic level by the physical sciences, extended to include biology. On the other side, there are doubts about whether the reality of such features of our world as consciousness, intentionality, meaning, purpose, thought, and value can be accommodated in a universe consisting at the most basic level only of physical facts. Facts, however sophisticated, of the kind revealed by the physical sciences.
Now it's interesting that he notes that, this is the same business we're talking about in Lewis from the 1940s and 50s, and he's basically saying this is still the conversation. Now, it's interesting that if you talk to people, a lot of people would say, no, this conversation's religious. Talk to certain people. Religion's been discredited. Well, not according to Thomas Nagel. And in fact, the conversation is still very much alive.
I will use the terms materialism or materialist naturalism to refer to one side of this conflict and anti-reductionism to refer to the other side, even though the terms are rather rough. The attempts to defend the materialist world picture as a potentially complete account of what there is take many forms, and not all of them involve reduction in the ordinary sense, such as the analysis of mental concepts in behavioral terms or the scientific identification of mental states with brain states. Many materialist naturalists would not describe their view as reductionist, but to those who doubt the adequacy of such a worldview, the different attempts to accommodate within it mind and related phenomena all appear as attempts to reduce the true extent of reality to a common basis that is not rich enough for the purpose. Hence, the resistance can be brought together as anti-reductionism. The tendency of these anti-reductionist doubts is usually negative. The conclusion they invite is that there are some things that the physical sciences alone cannot fully account for. Other forms of understanding may be needed, or perhaps there is more to reality than even the most fully developed physics can describe. If reduction fails in some respect, this reveals a limit to the reach of the physical sciences, which must therefore be supplemented by something else to account for the missing elements. But the situation may be more serious than that. If
that would, in a sense, what he just finished saying was similar to when people say, well, there's evolution over here and there's the Bible over here and we have a line between them, and so we can explain how human beings, how our bodies come about, and then spirit is an addition. That's where this kind of the one element over here that's like physical and the other element which is spiritual perhaps, and that's again some sort of a dualism. And he's saying, well, okay, but there are issues with that too.
If one doubts the reducibility of the mental to the physical, and likewise all of those other things that go with the mental, such as value and meaning, then there is some reason to doubt that a reductive materialism can apply even in biology, and therefore reason to doubt that materialism can give an adequate account even of the physical world. I want to explore the case for this breakdown, and to consider whether anything positive by way of a worldview is imaginable in the wake of it. We and other creatures with mental lives are organisms, and our mental capacities apparently depend on our physical constitution. So what explains the existence of organisms like us must also explain the existence of mind. But if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. And then, as I shall argue, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that those aspects of our physical constitution that bring with them the mental cannot be fully explained by physical science either. If evolutionary biology is a physical theory, as it is generally taken to be, then it cannot account for the appearance of consciousness and of other phenomena that are not physically reducible. So if mind is a product of biological evolution, if organisms with mental life are not miraculous anomalies but an integral part of nature, then biology cannot be a purely physical science. The possibility opens up of a pervasive conception of the natural order very different from materialism, one that makes mind central rather than a side effect of physical law. It seems clear that the conclusion of anti-reductionist arguments against materialism cannot remain purely negative forever. Even if the dominance of materialist naturalism is nearing its end, we need some idea of what might replace it. One of the things that drive the various reductionist programs about mind, value, and meaning, in spite of their inherent implausibility, is the lack of any comprehensive alternative. It can seem that the only way to accept the arguments against reduction is by adding peculiar extra ingredients like qualia, meanings, intentions, values, reasons, beliefs, and desires to the otherwise magnificently unified mathematical order of the physical universe. But this does not answer to the desire for a general understanding of how things fit together. A genuine alternative to the reductionist program would require an account of how mind and everything that goes with it is inherent in the universe. I am just turning a familiar argument on its head in order to challenge the premises. Materialism requires reductionism. Therefore, the failure of reductionism requires an alternative to materialism. My aim is not so much to argue against reductionism as to investigate the consequences of rejecting it, to present the problem rather than to propose a solution. Materialist naturalism leads to reductionist ambitions because it seems unacceptable to deny the reality of all those familiar things that are not, at first glance, physical. But if no plausible reduction is available, and if denying reality to the mental continues to be unacceptable, that suggests that the original premise, materialist naturalism, is false, and not just around the edges. Perhaps the natural order is not exclusively physical, or perhaps, in the worst case, there is no comprehensive natural order in which everything hangs together, only disconnected forms of understanding. But whatever may be the result, we must start out from a larger conception of what has to be understood in order to make sense of the natural world. 2. My guiding conviction is that mind is not just an afterthought, or an accident, or an add-on, but a basic aspect of nature.
Now again, if you get into Peterson, this is in a sense what he's playing in. To what degree is mind an aspect? And again, when I read Jung's autobiography, to what degree? So he goes into the mental hospital and he wants to talk to the crazy people, and all the other doctors say, "Don't talk to the crazy people; they're crazy." And he's like, "Well, isn't this our job? Maybe we should talk to them." And then he begins to discover that their insanity connects up with a world out there, and within that connection, you can actually make progress with respect to the internal world.
Quite apart from anti-reductionist arguments in the philosophy of mind, there is independent support for the step to such an enlarged conception of reality in one of the background conditions of science. Science is driven by the assumption that the world is intelligible. That is, the world in which we find ourselves, and about which experience gives us some information, can be not only described, but understood. That assumption is behind every pursuit of knowledge, including pursuits that end in illusion.
And it's important to see that that is an assumption. And it's important to weigh that as an assumption. Okay, what does it mean that it's an assumption? It basically means that we can't go forward without it. But when we go forward with it, we should remember we're carrying it.
In the natural sciences, as they have developed since the 17th century, the assumption of intelligibility has led to extraordinary discoveries, confirmed by prediction and experiment, of a hidden natural order that cannot be observed by human perception alone. Without the assumption,
and the way we assume that hidden natural order is perceived, it's not by human perception alone. In a sense, what Lewis is saying is that, well, we're using reason to perceive it. That is, in a sense, the scientific method. Through prediction and reproduction, reproducing an experiment, we can see into nature. Well, can you be within nature and see into nature? Or does being within nature therefore compromise your ability to see into nature?
Of an intelligible underlying order, which long antedates the scientific revolution, those discoveries could not have been made. What explains this order? One answer would be that nothing does. Explanation comes to an end with the order itself.
Now again, when you talk about this order that predates the scientific revolution, you're right there in the middle of the conversation. Now, when we're able to predict the motion of objects, is the prediction of that motion something we discover, or is it something we project onto the objects? That's no small question.
Order itself, which the assumption of intelligibility has merely enabled us to uncover. Perhaps one level of order can be explained in terms of a still deeper level, as has happened repeatedly in the history of science. But in the end, on this view of the matter, understanding of the world will eventually reach a point where there is nothing more to be said, except, this is just how things are. I am not disposed to see the success of science in this way. It seems to me that one cannot really understand the scientific worldview unless one assumes that the intelligibility of the world, as described by the laws that science has uncovered, is itself part of the deepest explanation of why things are as they are. So when we prefer one explanation of the same data to another, because it is simpler and makes fewer arbitrary assumptions, that is not just an aesthetic preference. It is because we think the explanation that gives greater understanding is more likely to be true, just for that reason. This assumption is a form of the principle of sufficient reason, that everything about the world can at some level be understood, and that if many things, even the most universal, initially seem arbitrary, that is because there are further things we do not know, which explain why they are not arbitrary after all. The view that rational intelligibility...
And this is in some ways science's, with Christianity, you sometimes get the argument that you have a God of the gaps, which means it's these things that we can't explain, oh, that's where God is. But these things that we can explain, well, that's where we are. And, well, science has a similar dynamic going on. And I often hear that with respect to, well, if someone gets sick, you don't pray. Well, people often only pray when the doctor can't heal them. And so then but they'll say, oh, but someday we'll be able to heal this. Oh, okay, well, that sounds to me a lot like eschatology. Someday Jesus will come again. Someday we'll be able to heal this. That's basically the same argument.
Intelligibility is at the root of the natural order makes me, in a broad sense, an idealist, not a subjective idealist, since it doesn't amount to the claim that all reality is ultimately appearance, but an objective idealist in the tradition of Plato and perhaps also of certain post-Kantians, such as Schelling and Hegel, who are usually called absolute idealists. I suspect that there must be a strain of this kind of idealism in every theoretical scientist. Pure empiricism is not enough. The intelligibility of the world is no accident. Mind, in this view, is doubly related to the natural order. Nature is such as to give rise to conscious beings with minds, and it is such as to be comprehensible to such beings. Ultimately, therefore, such beings should be comprehensible to themselves. And these are fundamental features of the universe, not byproducts of contingent developments whose true explanation is given in terms that do not make reference to mind. 3. The largest question within which all natural science is embedded is also the largest question of philosophy, namely, in what way or ways is the world intelligible? Clearly, natural science is one of the most important ways of revealing intelligibility. But in spite of the great accomplishments of the natural sciences in their present form, it is important both for science itself and for philosophy to ask how much of what there is the physical sciences can render intelligible. How much of the world's intelligibility consists in its subsumability under universal, mathematically formulable laws governing the spatio-temporal order? If there are limits to the reach of science in this form, are there other forms of understanding that can render intelligible what physical science does not explain?
Now, again, that's a really important point because, in a sense, the assumption behind naturalism is that it can all be explained. Okay. Remember what's true about assumptions. We need them to move forward, but when we move forward, we have to remember we're carrying them. And so if that's your assumption, you can't then turn it around and say, well, this is what I've proved. No, that's you brought that in with you. What does it mean to say the entire world is intelligible with the tools we have? We just haven't done it yet. Oh, okay. You haven't really said a lot. You've brought the assumption with you, and you're not saying, yeah, I started my argument with this. So then people, and again, this tends to be common people who are not academics will often say, oh, they'll just usually have to split up the world into some kind of dualism and say, well, there's this and there's that. These are things we can understand through these tools. These are things we can't understand through these tools. And the reason people make those assumptions is it's useful. You can quickly handle this problem that way. And okay, you can go on from there. But again, that's an assumption that you carry with you. Say, yep, this is what we can figure out with this tool. Can't figure out these things with that tool. If I break my arm, the doctor can set it. and that the doctor can cure, but if I have certain kinds of pancreatic cancer, then I'm going to pray. There's your little dualism.
But first, we should consider the view that there are no such limits, that physical law has the resources to explain everything, including the double relation of mind to the natural order. The intelligibility, to us, that makes science possible is one of the things that stand in need of explanation. The strategy is to try to extend the materialist world picture so that it includes such an explanation, thereby making the physical intelligibility of the world close over itself. According to this type of naturalism, the existence of minds to whom the world is scientifically intelligible is itself scientifically explicable, as a highly specific biological side effect of the physical order. The story goes like this. There is no need for an expanded form of understanding. Instead, the history of human knowledge gives us reason to believe that there is ultimately one way that the natural order is intelligible, namely through physical law. Everything that exists and everything that happens can in principle be explained by the laws that govern the physical universe.
That's C.S. Lewis's chapter 2, I believe. It's the whole show.
Admittedly, we can't grasp the natural order in its full manifestation because it is too complex, and we therefore need more specialized forms of understanding for practical purposes. But we can attempt to discover the universal principles governing the elements out of which everything is composed, and of which all observable spatio-temporal complexity is a manifestation. These are the mathematically statable laws of basic physics, which describe the fundamental forces and particles or other entities and their interactions, at least till a still more fundamental level is uncovered. The most systematic possible description of a material universe extended in space and time is therefore the route to the most fundamental explanation of everything. Physics and chemistry have pursued this aim with spectacular success. But the great step forward in the progress of the materialist conception toward the ideal of completeness was the theory of evolution, later reinforced and enriched by molecular biology and the discovery of DNA. Modern evolutionary theory offers a general picture of how the existence and development of life could be just another consequence of the equations of particle physics. Even if no one yet has a workable idea about the details, it is possible to speculate that the appearance of life was the product of chemical processes governed by the laws of physics, and that evolution after that is likewise due to chemical mutations and natural selection that are also just super complex consequences of physical principles. Even if there is a residual problem of exactly how to account for consciousness in physical terms, the orthodox naturalistic view is that biology is in principle completely explained by physics and chemistry, and that evolutionary psychology provides a rough idea of how everything distinctive about human life can also be regarded as an extremely complicated consequence of the behavior of physical particles in accordance with certain fundamental laws. This will ultimately include an explanation of the cognitive capabilities that enable us to discover those laws. I find it puzzling that this view of things should be taken as more or less self-evident, as I believe it commonly is.
In other words, this is sort of like, well, this is the assumption. This is what I bring to the conversation, but too long didn't read it. This is just the way it is, okay? Don't argue with me. If you argue with me, I'll call you a heretic. I'll interrupt your climb up the diamonds hierarchy. I'll mess with your career. I will assassinate your reputation. I will call you whatever name in the current order is the bad thing to be called.
Commonly is. Everyone acknowledges that there are vast amounts we do not know, and that enormous opportunities for progress in understanding lie before us. But scientific naturalists claim to know what the form of that progress will be, and to know that mentalistic, teleological, or evaluative intelligibility in particular have been left behind for good as fundamental forms of understanding. It is assumed not only that the natural order is intelligible, but that its intelligibility has a certain form, being found in the simplest and most unified physical laws, governing the simplest and fewest elements, from which all else follows. That is what scientific optimists mean by a theory of everything. So long as the basic laws are not themselves necessary truths, the question remains why those laws hold. But perhaps part of the appeal of this conception is that if the laws are simple enough, we can come to rest with them and be content to say that this is just how things are. After all, what is the alternative? That is really my question. The implausibility of the reductive program that is needed to defend the completeness of this kind of naturalism provides a reason for trying to think of alternatives. Alternatives that make mind, meaning, and value as fundamental as matter and space-time in an account of what there is.
And right there, you have, in a sense, where Jordan Peterson walks into the room and says, yep, all of this stuff is just as important as that stuff. And he doesn't lay it all out for us, and we can't all hear it. Too long didn't read it. But I think, in a sense, our watchers know more than we know, kind of. And that's what dictates interest. And so when we watch Jordan Peterson doing this, we begin to say, oh, maybe the temple of naturalism isn't what I thought it was. Now, you start walking out of the temple of naturalism, there's only one other major temple, and that's theism. And that's why in a tweet yesterday, someone made the comment that, Jordan Peterson is practically a theist. Now, again, that's complicated with Peterson. He's not a simple thinker. But these are the two temples. Now, Nagel wants to say, I don't like the options. I want a third option. So here we have a classic third way thing. And many of you understand what happens with third ways. But I'm not saying they're not true, because often third ways become one of the next two ways that go on going forward. But this is exactly where Nagel is saying it, because you've got naturalism and you've got theism. And these are really your only two options.
There is. The fundamental elements and laws of physics and chemistry have been inferred to explain the behavior of the inanimate world. Something more is needed to explain how there can be conscious, thinking creatures whose bodies and brains are composed of those elements. If we want to try to understand the world as a whole, we must start with an adequate range of data, and those data must include the evident facts about ourselves. 4. As a way of marking the boundaries of the territory in which the search for such understanding must proceed, I would now like to say something about the polar opposite of materialism, namely the position that mind, rather than physical law, provides the fundamental level of explanation of everything, including the explanation of the basic and universal physical laws themselves. This view is familiarly expressed as theism, in its aspect as an explanation of the existence and character of the natural world. It is the most straightforward way of reversing the materialist order of explanation, which explains mind as a consequence of physical law. Instead, theism makes physical law a consequence of mind.
Which is exactly what Lewis will do in his book Miracles.
Consequence of mind. Considered as a response to the demand for an all-encompassing form of understanding, theism interprets intelligibility ultimately in terms of intention or purpose, resisting a purely descriptive endpoint. At the outer bounds of the world, encompassing everything in it, including the law-governed natural order revealed by science, theism places some kind of mind or intention which is responsible for both the physical and the mental character of the universe. So long as the divine mind just has to be accepted as a stopping point in the pursuit of understanding, it leaves the process incomplete, just as the purely descriptive materialist account does. For either materialistic or theistic
Now at the end of that paragraph there, it's interesting because at some point you've got to give the naturalists and Nagel their due and say, yeah, theists said God made the world, cool, and went on from there. And science, done by Christians, did a lot to reduce human suffering and address this. But they did it at the price of excluding this other element. And so then you add in a sense of dualism, where the scientists were doing this on one hand and then going to church on the other hand. And again, I'm reading the Clockwork Universe, which nicely illustrates the religious belief of all these foundational features of science. And they were doing, natural philosophy, and they were doing it as Christians. And we look back on them and say, oh, that's horrible. But this is how they were making their way there. But in a sense, what happened is you split the world. And when I started listening to Peterson, I began to say, the watchers in the back of my head began to say, he's trying to put it back together. Oh, well, so is Nagel. And that is, in a sense, the theory of everything. And so in physics over here, you have the theory of everything. And Nagel and Peterson are over there saying, yeah, but you can't leave people out of it. Because here's the crazy thing. Back in the day, you could say, and God created heaven and earth, and live with that. And in fact, within your religious system, live pretty well. Now, you maybe didn't have antibiotics, or you didn't have a number of other things that we have today. But in terms of community and society, and in terms of naturally experiencing meaning and happiness and purpose, that worldview delivered that. And part of Peterson's big claim is, okay, put that out over there. Well, you're kind of sliding into nihilism, which is individual, or tyranny, which is the individual, asserting himself over the rest of them. In a sense, tyranny is naturalism plus you, or plus the dictator. And that's where Peterson in his biblical exposition looks at and says, yeah, once the king no longer recognizes a God over him, he will become a tyrant. Because that's where this slides. In other words, the consequence of materialism is nihilism, tyranny. And then suddenly you have the question, can you have this liberty, which we enjoy? And I just this morning saw Penn Jillette talk about how important liberty was. And I think, yeah, Penn Jillette, I've seen your other videos too about how there is no God. And so Peterson walks into the room and says, really, if you're a materialist, you're going to slide to tyranny and nihilism. And all the materialists gasp, because listen to some of Sam Harris's political stuff. He doesn't like Trump. He had a very interesting conversation with Snyder, who's an expert on a lot of the stuff that Peterson likes to study in terms of the tyranny of the Soviet Union and Nazism. Snyder wrote his little book about that recently. It's a great little book. And the conversation he had with Sam Harris was a great conversation. And so that's why Peterson is coming to Sam Harris and saying, you're a Christian. And Sam Harris says, no, I'm not a Christian. And Peterson says, yes, you are, because either you account for the mind and you account for this half of the world, or you are going to slide into tyranny and nihilism. And the reason you're not sliding into tyranny and nihilism is because secretly underneath it all, you are maintaining your Christian assumptions. And if Nietzsche were in the room with you, he'd attack you, because he'd say, you're full of it. And so Peterson, as in a sense a disciple of Nietzsche, will take that role.
For theistic explanation to provide a complete understanding of the world, it would have to be the case that either the laws of physics, or the existence and properties of God and therefore of his creation, cannot conceivably be other than they are. Physicists do not typically believe the former, but theists tend to believe the latter. This doesn't mean that a theistic worldview must be deterministic. God's essential nature may lead him to create probabilistic laws and beings with free will, whose actions are explained as free choices. But some kind of divine intention would underpin the totality.
And that is exactly what Lewis does with reason and nature. He says, in a sense, he doesn't say in a sense, he says it directly, that every time we reason, we are using a non-naturalistic capacity given to us by the source of all reason. That's what Lewis is saying. That's where he's going. And he said, now I'm going to play that out, and I'm going to show you how Christianity gives the best articulation of that. Now, Peterson is coming at it from a different way. Peterson is coming at it from a historical way, whereas C.S. Lewis in the 40s watched communism and fascism working and said, that's where this goes. But he didn't put it together with Darwin and Nietzsche, and he didn't grab Dostoevsky, he didn't have Solzhenitsyn, he didn't have any of that. Peterson, at the sense of the end of it, is coming to it and saying, without ever saying C.S. Lewis, we'll see if I can get him to say C.S. Lewis, C.S. Lewis is right. And that's why I think Peterson keeps getting tagged with C.S. Lewis.
The interest of theism, even to an atheist, is that it tries to explain in another way what does not seem capable of explanation by physical science. The inadequacies of the naturalistic and reductionist world picture seem to me to be real. There are things that science as presently conceived does not help us to understand, and which we can see, from the internal features of physical science, that it is not going to explain. They seem to call for a more uncompromisingly mentalistic or even normative form of understanding. Theism embraces that conclusion by attributing the mental phenomena found within the world to the working of a comprehensive mental source, of which they are miniature versions. However, I do not find theism any more credible than materialism as a comprehensive worldview. My interest is in the territory between them. I believe that these two radically opposed conceptions of ultimate intelligibility cannot exhaust the possibilities. All explanations come to an end somewhere. Both theism and materialism say that at the ultimate level, there is one form of understanding. But would an alternative secular conception be possible that acknowledged mind and all that it implies, not as the expression of divine intention, but as a fundamental principle of nature along with physical law? Could it take the form of a unified conception of the natural order, even if it tries to accommodate a richer set of materials than the austere elements of mathematical physics? But let me first say a bit more, for dialectical purposes, about the opposition between theism and materialist naturalism and what is lacking in each of them.
This goes on for a while, and I've gone on for a while. So I'll pause it here at 5. But I think you see where Peterson comes in here. So Nagel, in a sense, is saying, there's two options. There's naturalism and theism. Those are the two options. And I don't like them because naturalism doesn't finally work because it excludes mind. And theism, well, I don't like the idea of a God. And later on in the book, Nagel just pretty much says that. I don't want there to be a God. Because if there's a God, well, as a pastor, I'd love to sit down with him and say, if there's a God, what? Or maybe Jordan Peterson to say, well, if there's a God, what? Why don't you want there to be a God? Well, because, theologically, because I want to be God. That's what I want to be. Okay. And I would say, well, let's take a step into the 12-step world. Okay, well, that's where you begin. You want to be God. And are you up to the task? So Peterson walks in and looks at these two options, and he's, well, can we have theism? Can we have what theism has to offer without getting without going to church? And I'd say, oh, come on, it doesn't hurt that much. But his point is well taken. And actually, another video I kind of thought about doing today was to talk a little bit more about where church fits into this picture, because I've been talking more about that in my sermon. And actually, I'm kind of surprising myself when I'm talking about this, because I've always been pretty high in openness, and a part of my agenda has been, now, where does church fit into this world? What do we do when we come in on Sunday and we worship? That's really weird in a secular frame. And there's a reason why people walk into there and they might say, well, I like to worship if it feels good to me. Oh, okay. Well, there's a reason I can understand. But I like to worship because it feels good to God. Oh boy, that's complicated. But it's not complicated if you're just a really born into the thing theist. So there you are. So yeah, Nagel needs to be a part of this conversation, and we'll see what we do with him.